Hi there, Chris from TotallyEV, and here we're doing a dedicated audio review of the Honda Civic EHEV. If you'd like a detailed review of the vehicle itself, do check it up on your pop banner, down in the description below, or indeed in the pinned comments. Now to kick off this video, we have to talk about its audio configuration. And here in the Elegance and Sport trims, you've got an 8-speaker setup. You've got full range drivers found within each of the 4 doors, and tweeters found at the rear, whereby they're integrated within the rear doors, and tweeters found at the front within the A-pillars. If, however, you move over to the Advanced trim, which we have on review, you'll have a 12-speaker Bose setup instead. This therefore integrates mid-range drivers within the rear parcel shelf, and you've also got a singular mid-range driver that is found within the center of the dashboard. As for the boot, you've also got an inclusion of a subwoofer. This does also bolster the overall sub-bass extension, and we'll touch upon this very shortly. Now, for you to tinker around with the audio drivers, you'll want to navigate on the 9-inch infotainment system. And here, in our case, we've added 3 notches to treble and taken 1 notch off mid-range and bass. We've also enabled the Bose center point feature, which we'll touch upon further down in this review. Now, if you do want to connect up to the infotainment system, you have got Bluetooth, whereby the SBC and AAC codecs are supported only. If, however, you want higher quality fidelity, you want to plug it in. By the USB Type-A ports, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are supported. Although it's worth noting over here, Apple CarPlay is also supported over a wireless format, so that will definitely add to the overall convenience factor. This might come in at a later date for Android Auto via future firmware updates, but at least at the time of filming and in the UK, it is not supported. So moving swiftly on, we get onto cabin noise, and here the numbers will be on your screen. Now, for those who are subscribed, you'll realize that the standstill and indeed the figures at a lower speeds are surprisingly high. And indeed, this is because when we're testing the Civic Hybrid, we had no controls of turning on or off the EV function. And as a result, meant that the engine was chugging away at the front of the vehicle, therefore powering the battery and of course the front wheel drive system. And this meant that effectively that it was a little bit louder. Furthermore, even in EV mode, the overall cabin insulation does seem to be a bit subpar, and you can hear a little bit of road noise creeping in from the tyres and a little bit of wind deflecting off the A-pillars. Now, suffice to say, it's not too bad, although in comparison to some of its competitors, it's not as serene. Now, with all of that in mind, let's get on to a sound demo. We're going to be playing back a track, which is more specifically from Priya J, titled Like Me, and we'll be placing the camera and the microphone in 4 separate locations and adjusting certain settings. Do check out the annotations on your screen to understand how the system is currently running. Now, I appreciate an audio demo is never ideal over YouTube, so let me get on to my subjective opinion. Now, to start off with the sub-bass extension, I felt it was very much pronounced. Indeed, over here, the subwoofer does deliver that low echelons of those bass tones, and while it can't quite compete with more premium systems out there on the market, whereby those subwoofers just seem to be a little bit better versed, it is still very much appreciated at this price point. Now, as for the mid-bass, it's very much lively and exciting. I had no sort of problems both in terms of the quantity or quality, although saying that, I did take out 1 notch from the bass EQ in order to reduce the default EQ because it just felt a little bit overpowering. Speaking of which, here the mid-bass does leak into the lower mids and therefore does provide a somewhat V-shaped sound signature, therefore taking an effect on vocal tunes. Now you might have remembered I actually took out one notch from the mid-range EQ, so you might be quick to say, well, why don't you just add extra notches to the mid-range EQ? Well, doing so will actually take away from the overall accuracy, and in my case I actually found that the default EQ was still a little bit inaccurate, so therefore taking one notch off it added to the overall accuracy, but then I just had to remember that it's going to be pushing back the mid-range even further, and therefore further creating a V-shaped sound signature. Now on the flip side, the highs are absolutely done exquisitely well, both at the front and rear of the cabin thanks to the inclusion of dedicated tweeters. Add that zingy nature at the top end, specifically with a few notches added to the treble EQ, I felt quite lively while listening back to my favourite tracks. Now moving past its frequency range, what about when it comes to the overall soundstage reproduction? Well, here it really depends in terms of the setting that you're using. On one hand, the Bose center point when it's enabled does give you a real cabin filling experience and one that's pretty engaging. Better still, the overall width and depth is fantastic, and similarly is the instrument separation. But on the flip side, there's a slight odd reverb, so those audiophiles out there that have reference systems at home might actually pick out that their music does feel a little bit odd. Now if you were to disable the Bose center point option, of course you'll get a bit more reference sound, but then get a unidirectional sound where the overall width and depth just feels quite closed. Here, the instrument separation is not affected thanks to the inclusion of the drivers both at the front and the rear of the cabin, but nonetheless it's just something worth noting. Ultimately over here, we would definitely recommend using the Bose center point option, but just remember that the reverb that you're experiencing isn't your ears, but rather the system as to how it's actually dealing with the overall algorithm and the processing of your audio. So with all of that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict. And frankly, the audio system isn't exactly perfect, but given the price point it comes in at and the fact that the advanced trim level does have a 12 speaker Bose system that will actually do well across the frequency range, we can certainly see ourselves recommending it over the elegance or sport trims, in other words getting a bettered soundstage reproduction and a much bettered sub-bass extension. As a result, it gets our approved audio award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of the audio system down in the comment section below, and of course if you like this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.